Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for coming to my talk here this evening. This is the kind of educational experience that I wish I had had in university, where they serve drinks in the classroom. Well, we had a little on the side anyway, but today we're going to talk about the Falklands, and I imagine all of you have heard of it. Has anybody actually been there before? Ah, there we go. So maybe you are what they call a belonger, having moved there. But it is a remarkable part of the world. When I used to work on these ships to Antarctica, we would come by the Falklands on our way back to the warm and sunny tropics. And it is a remarkable place that has, of course, had a difficult history I'll talk about. But someone was there with us last week and had heard that the Falklands were just like England about 40 or 50 years ago, to which the answer was she didn't know that there were that few people in England 50 years ago. Well, anyway, it is a place down here at the end of South America. We have just sailed out of the Golfo Nuevo of Puerto Madryn. We're heading on a course right for Stanley due to the southeast. And these islands are, the maps always show them as green, but they're not very green actually. But they have actually an archipelago of some 700 islands and tiny islands, with the main two islands being the East and West Falklands. Now here's the flag of the Falklands with, of course, the Union Jack, and then the emblem is this motto, "Desire the right." Now, it refers to the righteousness of the people who live there, and they will tell you all about it. But I'm just wondering when they're going to give human rights to the sheep. But not quite yet. Meanwhile, we have these actually three very large islands, because there's the Lafonia. This island here is part of East Falkland. There's only a narrow peninsula. We're going over to Stanley. And then the West Falkland is even less populated. There's only shy of 4,000 people who live on the whole archipelago, but over 2,000 of them live right around Stanley. So this is a very sparsely populated group of islands, but there are over 500,000 sheep. In the middle, there's this tremendous sound, the Falkland Sound, which in ancient times was a major whale calving area. When the first whalers went down, they found this area completely filled with whales, and of course now there are hardly any left. There's still some off to the south, and they are still sighted, but the whales are largely exterminated, unfortunately. So we are going, of course, to Stanley. The first settlement was this area called Puerto Soledad, and then Port Egmont. And those are still have some people, but most people are in either Stanley or in farm encampments out around the various islands. Many of the small islands are owned wholly by one family. Puerto Soledad is the later name for Port Louis, and then the RAF and the current British military force have about 1,800 troops at Mount Pleasant. Now, this is a very windswept land that is very cold and dark in the winter, but in the summer it grows a kind of a scrub and a heather, and then has many, many bays and inlets. Traditionally, the people would get around by boat because it was very hard to get over some of the mountains and the crevices of this rough land. And so people would go through and out and around. I met one man who lived on an island in West Falkland, and he spent 1 month going to Stanley every year to just get supplies and go back to his island. It was so remote even that people didn't ever meet each other, even though they were living in the same group of islands. The center of especially East Falkland Island has this very rugged ridge in it, and the ground is often very boggy in places, so even a horse or a cart will get caught in mud on the way over the land, and then face these very rough, rocky stretches that are very hard to get over. But nonetheless, settlers have been there since the mid-1700s. It's been under British rule as part of Crown Colony since 1833. I'll talk about the history a bit later. But there are settlements in these faraway places, and you can get an idea of what this is to have your front yard view. But it is not so icy that you'll see here. There's even some palm trees and kind of pampa grass that grows in the Falklands. In the winter, though, it's covered with an ice sheet and it's very quiet. And last week I asked somebody there and said, "What do you do in the winter?" And the women knit and the men drink, which reminds me of a story. Why do women knit? It's to give them something to think about while they're talking. But why don't men learn how to knit? They're too busy speaking and talking to learn how. Well, anyway, that's a Falklands story. So here's actually our entrance into Port William, which is a sort of a fjord that goes into the island and then past some fortifications. This gun you can see there was actually taken off of one of the ships from World War I to defend the harbor. But we'll come into this large bay, and Stanley is just to the south of it. The Narrows, as it's called, is such a gap to get in that larger vessels such as this cannot get into the old harbor. So we will anchor and tender through the Narrows into the town. But you'll notice right in this area there are all these white sandy beaches, so it sort of looks like Barbados without the Calypso band. So here's the Narrows, the lighthouse coming in, and Stanley itself, which is the array of houses along the shore, and then the port. You'll see these vessels we were just in last week. These are oil exploration vessels. They're there now testing the shelf around the Falklands in prospecting for what is expected to be major oil reserves. Now here's the overview, and the town is very easy to walk through. It's mainly along the waterfront. The older section, of course, is downtown, and then newer development above. And we'll land at a dock and be greeted here with a visitor center. And then there's some shopping and a few pubs, a few restaurants, and the museums right downtown. So those of you who are on the history tour, that's a very easy walk of a few miles. If you're taking one of the excursions to the Penguin Coves, that is actually quite a ride out of town, and it is much more vast than you imagine, these islands, once you're there. So there's these the government blocks and various old housing. This is actually the Pioneer Row of the original earliest settlement and earliest houses. One of the houses is a museum, the Cruffaff House. And then down on the waterfront you have the main Christchurch Cathedral, which has as its significant centerpiece this blue whale rib. I'm not sure what to call it. It's an altar to the lost souls of the poor whales, but this was supposedly the biggest whale ever caught there. A 90-foot blue whale was hauled in, and then this was made out of its bones. Up the hill in the neighborhood, there's one family that has collected bones from around the shores of the Falklands and made a whale museum somewhat into protest. So if you go up higher, you'll see the house. They have their peat pile, which is the traditional fuel for the wintertime, although now mostly it's natural gas. And then he has a harpoon and bones and more skulls and such, and sorts of testimony to the slaughter that happened. Hundreds of thousands of whales were taken out of the Southern Ocean and the Falklands, and then down South Georgia Island were the major rendering and shipping facilities for it. But of course now it is, most people are not doing it, but only the Japanese. Well, that's not my issue tonight. But at that whale museum, this fellow has the last of the reindeer that were brought from Norway to be perhaps a wild standing cattle crop in the Falklands, but they didn't take to the climate. I think it was too warm for them, perhaps. But this is the last of the mangy reindeer. But most in the town, you see a lot of English cottages and gardens this time of year. The flowers are all out, and one garden actually has some wildlife from England. Yes, those are them. Captured. They're corralled. They don't want to let them out because they might bite people. Then right on the waterfront, here's that government block again, and I show this because there's an old cannon, a few monuments in that area, but there's a big old mizzen mast from the great ship, the Great Britain, which was a wreck in Stanley Harbor. Now this was the world's biggest iron-built ship in 1854, had a service around the world, then ended up being scrapped and used for storage in the Falklands. And Stanley Harbor had all of these derelict ships in it that were beaten up going around the Horn, and they come in and then they would either be repaired or else they were stayed there, and they were used for storage of wool and coal and things like that. But this very important ship of its era was picked up, towed back to England, is now restored in the harbor at Bristol as a testament to the British maritime tradition. That's its mizzenmast. Well, some didn't make it. Here's one that's just in the harbor right near there, which is one of hundreds of shipwrecks around the neighborhood. Here's the most famous in Stanley Harbor, the Lady Elizabeth or Lady Liz, which is an iron Cape Horner that didn't quite make it but is standing there as a testament to that era. but there are all around the shores are the bones of many more ships. And first ship I ever worked on, the Lindblad Explorer, sank a couple of years ago on its way to the Falklands, so it didn't make it into Stanley Harbor, unfortunately. But in the town, you can hear these tales and even taller if you go to a few of the pubs. I know after you've been on the ship for a while, you get really thirsty for some warm ale, but they do have it at the Globe and a few other pubs in town. But if you talk to the locals, they'll tell you, oh, don't go to that pub because it's full of drunks. Go to my pub where we know how to drink. And so I went there, and you can see the flags of the various regiments and ships that come in, and it's, let's say, a highly decorated pub in that way. And I happened last week to sit down with this guy, Doug Trennett, who was a World War II Navy veteran, and then he was captured by the Argentines and imprisoned during the war, and then he got another medal for having been in the Falklands War. He said a war that he didn't pick the fight, though. But he's at age 83, he holds his own at the Globe. And then as a small town, they have news and a very human existence, let's say, nonetheless. And I heard from the sheep that they're glad they caught this guy. But you can read the details later. So, but if you go out into the countryside, there's the roads quickly turn gravel, and then they go beyond that. This is quite a fleet of Land Rovers in the islands, and so if you go to any of the penguin rookeries or out to the camps, they call them, the farm, or the battlefield tour, you'll go out on these roads out of Stanley, and then they open up a cattle gate, and they'll just go right across the tundra, which is quite a bumpy ride. But occasionally you run into a traffic jam, like this guy Rob was taking us out, and he honked, and they honked back. But if you go out there, it's very windy and very rough, and you see the sign says a difficult road, and you may get blown off the road. Of course, there is no road to get blown off. But you see that circle in the middle, that's not a crop circle or a helipad, that's an old stone sheep pen. And then, but that's the way that people get around. Now, in this case, these kids probably should have asked their parents' permission before they took the Land Rover out. They had to be pulled out. Very rough country. And the sheep are all over the place. There are 500,000 sheep, but you don't see them. And the answer that I got the other day was, they're afraid of us. For good reasons, I suppose. But they come in and get shorn this time of year, and then a few of them turn into lamb chops. But again, that's the major industry of the Falklands, now added to with fisheries. And there's a fishery patrol around. There's some 50 million pounds of catch that is sent to the UK and Europe. And the other one in business may be oil. But the land is very stark and rugged and kind of dramatic, of course. It has a curious phenomenon I've never seen anywhere else, what they call the rock runs, which are these great streams of boulders that are spread out in the fields, and they are actually impassable because they're fairly good-sized boulders. And it's not known how they happen. It's perhaps a result of when the Ice Age melted away and the glaciers, the snow cap or ice field that was once over the Falklands retreated. They had scraped the mountains and let these what looked like streams of rocks. You see that road across it. And the rocks up on the peaks are that same kind of rock. So they're undoubtedly a result of erosion. But I'll give you a little, just the background of the islands, because when Magellan came through the Straits in 1519, he did not come across the Falkland Islands. Other mariners kept following, and they kept coming to these islands, often in storm conditions. And in 1592, Captain John Davis came and he said, on the 14th, we were driven among certain isles never before discovered. They lie 50 leagues or better from the shore, in which place, unless it had pleased God in his wonderful mercy to have ceased the wind, we must of necessity have perished. Because the Falkland Islands actually have this fairly current regular wind coming from the west-southwest, which is part of the great sweep of current and winds that come through the Cape Horn and around South America, as if the Andes sort of let this whole sweep of wind come off, and then they hit the Falklands along with where we're going to be going, Terra del Fuego. But on this old chart, you can see the Isles of Sebald and the Anyen Islands This was back when it was discovered by both Spanish, French, and English. And that's part of the contention of the islands, is that from the earliest times, various people went there, but nobody wanted to stay because of the conditions. The first settlement, though, was in 1754 by the French, and they set up, they call Saint Louis, which is now called Puerto Soledad. But that was a settlement by Bretons from Saint-Malo, France. And so the name Malvinas is the Spanish version of the Malouin, which was the French settlement there. So if the Argentines claim it in the name of the Spanish, they're actually using a version of the French name. Well, then the first British came in 1765, and Sir John Byron equipped an expedition to go down to make a settlement somewhere in Tierra del Fuego, but came instead to the Falklands, and then later sent some crofters and sheep and set up the first settlement. Now the French were over not very far away, but it took them 5 years before they even knew each other they were there because of the nature of the islands. They couldn't get over them, and they came in once sailing around. They were surprised to see anybody else was there. And they had an agreement that, well, we both claim it, but it's such a faraway place with so much room and so few people, there's no reason to fight over it. Then in 1770, though, the Spanish attacked, and they demanded that it be part of Spanish America and Argentina. And there was a fight and then a standoff at actually Stanley, and then they agreed to disagree, essentially, that they could stay there, but they would both claim sovereignty. The conditions were so bad, though, that the settlers all left, and they left plaques claiming sovereignty, but nobody came back until 1820, when Colonel Jewett came and then surveyed the islands. Now, this was the first name in English, Hawkins Maiden's Land, which was named after Captain Hawkins, and Maidenland was supposedly in honor to the Queen Elizabeth I. So the islands were surveyed, and then they became the interest for other settlement. But when the British first came back, they were in Berkeley Sound, which is, it says here, an undulating land with a desolate and wretched aspect. Now, nobody who lives in the Falklands think that. They call cities that, not their islands. But then when the Argentine Republic was set up as the provinces of the Rio Plata, this man, Donald Jewett, who was an American privateer hired to be a leader of the Argentine Navy, he came into Port Stanley and demanded it again to be part of Argentina, to which the British said, what's Argentina? And then there was another setup of sealing. This was the big business then. There was a village which was only taking elephant seals and whaling, and there were a lot of American whalers and sealers down there at the time, and the Louis Vernet, who was a Frenchman who ran the operation, claimed that the American sealers couldn't be there. So then in 1828, the U.S. Navy came and attacked that settlement, saying that they could not interfere with free trade, meaning we all get what we want out of it. So this was sort of the tumultuous beginning of the Falklands. 1833, though, the full settlement was made in Stanley and named after the Earl of Derby. I don't believe he ever went there, but he may have invested in the construction of the larger settlement there. And then it was finally named the Falkland Islands after the Viscount of Falklands, a man named Anthony Carey. But I've looked on the map of the UK. I can't find where Falkland is. Does anybody know? It's the mystery that I'm sure somebody knows where the original Falkland is, but we haven't found. But nonetheless, there were a few people who came down and were mainly in the sheep industry, the crofters, but they called themselves the kelpers because they would go gather kelp from the seashore and put it on the gardens to make this otherwise rocky soil fertile enough to grow a little bit of food, though most foodstuffs to this day come in from a long way. The other thing they do is cut peat for heat, and this is a picture of them cutting the peat. And so then, since 1833, the Falklands have been a crown colony and with an appointed governor and then a local council, and the current governor is Nick Harwood, and has its own, the Falklands have its own currency, so you'll see when you're there, you'll get change that's par with, of course, the pound sterling, and dollars are also, of course, accepted. Now, the wars that have happened down there started not just, of course, what we know recently. They go back to those early conflicts which were barely noticed anywhere else at the time. But in World War I, December 1914, the German Pacific Fleet sailed around Cape Horn after they had a battle off of Chile, by the way, with the Royal Navy, but then they were going to go up to the North Atlantic to join the party, and the Royal Navy was waiting at the Falklands for them, sighted them, and then had a decisive battle off of the port of Stanley. Now, the German fleet was larger, but they were outmaneuvered, and then most of the German vessels were either damaged or sunk, and included the loss of the flagship of the German fleet that had as his commander the Admiral Count von Graf Spee. And the later battleship, the Graf Spee, that was scuttled in Montevideo Harbor, was named after him. So this was, again, the first victory of World War I in the naval services, somewhat comparable to the hunting of the Graf Spee. And so this was commemorated with this monument in Stanley Harbor, because at that time, Stanley and the Falklands were primarily a Navy station, a coaling station, to make sure that the Navy had supplies and a base in the South Atlantic, and that is the tradition why it is a strategic value, these islands. Well, then in 1982, the military junta of Argentina pressed its claim to the British government and to the rest of the United Nations that the islands were Argentine. When the United Nations was formed, they laid that claim with the Decolonialization Committee of the United Nations, and as part of that process in the 1940s and 50s, the requirement was that there had to be a plebiscite of the residents to agree to be decolonialized. And of course, the Falklanders were 99% British, and so only a couple of Argentine tourists voted against the proposal at the time. But meanwhile, the junta, which was having terrible social problems, economic problems in Argentina, started beating the tin drum of nationalism, and then went to Washington. They sent a foreign minister to Washington who had a cocktail party with then Secretary of State, the UN ambassador of the U.S., Jeane Kirkpatrick. And he informally asked her, what would the U.S. do if we took back the Falklands? And our former speaker on board, Stephen Daci, who was a Foreign Service officer, said he was there at that conversation as a Latin American specialist. And Jeane Kirkpatrick was so stunned that she didn't answer. And then the Argentine foreign minister went back to Buenos Aires and said, oh, she winked at me, meaning it's okay. Which again says if a diplomat who says nothing is not a diplomat, because any good diplomat is supposed to at least speak twice to say nothing. But she didn't. She didn't answer. And so therefore they thought, well, Washington and the UN and the rest of them won't interfere. But of course, it didn't work out that way. So a commando group from Buenos Aires, or the southern forces of the Argentine Navy, came ashore and then came to Stanley, sank some vessels, landed more troops. These are Argentine troop carriers coming down the streets of Stanley, and then seized the Royal Marine contingent there and humiliated them by searching them and then imprisoning them. And then there was celebrations all through Argentina that they had taken back their islands. The claim for them on their part is that they're just offshore and they're part of the continental shelf, but they've never had a Spanish or Argentine population there at all. But this meant that let's say the junta had whipped up some nationalistic feeling. So Admiral Araya and General Galtieri thought that they had, let's say, done a great anti-colonialist, anti-imperialist act by conquering and imperializing the poor people in the Falklands. But they didn't know who they were up against. And so Maggie Thatcher, who was having her own troubles at the time, as famously as she said, I don't think so, and immediately dispatched an expeditionary force while there was diplomatic efforts to try to, let's say, come to some negotiated settlement. And she refused to hear about it, and also the Argentines said, no, we have it, it's ours, that's it. And so here's Alexander Haig on his missions to try to find some nonviolent solution to this, but it wasn't going to be that way. And at the time, South America and Spain all allied in discussions in the UN with Argentina, except for Chile, which was very important because Chile provided the British forces intelligence and air landing rights to assist in the operation. So the first Marines and Air Force came down. This was in April 1982, and it was just beginning winter there, and so helicopters crashed. There was immediate loss of life. The Argentines had these Ecoset French missiles that they sank the HMS Sheffield and then also the HMS Antelope. And so the war was not getting off to a very good start for the British. And meanwhile, the other forces were coming down, but the Argentine had, their air force had pretty much covered the islands and were effective in stopping the first forces coming from the far north down. And they thought that they were going to win. Here's Estamos ganando, which is we're winning. And so this was going to be a quick victory for the Argentines, they thought. But meanwhile, there was, of course, a larger force being prepared, including troop ships, as in the QE2, fitted out to come down. But it's a very long way. And the key to the logistics was Ascension Island, which is another British possession, but it was at this time a U.S. naval base. And then the U.S. gave permission to use it for this operation and thereby assisting the British in the long way down. So here are a few of the young soldiers on the QE2. Obviously they didn't have room service and coffee in their suite, but they packed the ship, and if you've been on it, the ship was quite reconfigured, especially the stern end for helicopter landings. But it only went down to the Ascension Island rather than being risked in the further southern waters. So I like this cover here, The Empire Strikes Back. And so the fleet, the Air Force and the Navy aircraft carriers came, including the Invincible. By the way, this ship is up for sale. I don't know if you read it in the paper, and supposedly it's going to become a restaurant karaoke club in South China, which may be a very dangerous ship. Don't ever go near it. But the Royal Air Force with the Vulcans quickly, those are like bombers and other aircraft, drove away the A4 Argentine Air Force, took air superiority with the help of the Chileans. There was refueling done in Chile, much to the consternation of the Argentines. And then let's say the sea battle surrounded the islands. There were a couple more Ecoset attacks, but France refused to give any more to the Argentines because France and UK have this thing called NATO together, and so when Argentina wanted more supplies, the French refused, much to their great honor. And then this was the flagship of the Argentine Navy that came out, the heavy cruiser, formerly an American warship, that was then going to bombard and be the center of the Argentine defense of the islands, but it was sunk by a submarine, with the loss of many hundred of the sailors. So that was the greatest single loss in the battle, though many of them were rescued. The total losses were 649 Argentines, 225 British from air to sea to Marines. This was the vessel that sank the Belgrano, and curiously it's flying the Jolly Roger, which I didn't know was an official Royal Navy flag till this. But here's the reaction, of course, in the UK. Though curiously also, Union boycotts war. So there was some criticism about why are we shedding blood over these rocky islands and so many sheep, and why don't we just let them have it and not go through all this trouble? Well, that was a very minority opinion because, as you well know, the British public strongly supported this as a matter of pride, if not actually resource interest. Then the Royal Marines landed on the Falklands Sound. This is in the Sound area, and then came over towards Stanley. They did not assault directly right in town or where we're anchoring here. And over every hill and over every bog, they pushed the Argentines back. Many of the Argentine soldiers were mere conscripts, and they were never well trained. They were not volunteers by any means, had nowhere near the motivation of the British troops. And so many of them just dropped down their arms and quickly surrendered, and it was quickly over in a few weeks. By June of 1982, Stanley was taken, and then they were all rounded up and then repatriated back to Argentina. But there's still remains of this war around. If you take the war battlefield tour, you'll see some of it. Here's a pile of weapons, which I think they cleaned up now. But you can still see some of the encampments of the Argentine army outside of Stanley, including some of the vehicles that they commandeered. Now, I was with a fellow in Stanley who was an auto mechanic, and when the Argentines came in, they immediately requisitioned all the vehicles, and he was the mechanic, so he went around to make sure that they all had things loose so they didn't get far. And he sabotaged everybody's cars, and then he had a business for years later fixing everything he had sabotaged. Anyway, that's one of the legacies of the war. But one of the worst things that happened was minefields all through, or especially around Stanley. So there were some 18,000 mines laid, and that is still a problem outside of the town. There's still many areas that are fenced off. As part of the agreement after the war, though, the Argentines gave their military maps, and then it's all been mapped out, and now there's been an active campaign to try to demine all of these areas lest the sheep get loose. And so this, let's say, sad and unnecessary war has its war monument in Buenos Aires, if you've seen it, and there's a lot of that up and down, especially the south coast of Argentina, where they honor those poor so-and-sos who were dragged out there. And they've actually become a protest group because they got no benefits, and many of them became very depressed, and they have a whole group of Malvinas War veterans who are virulently anti-military, which is one of the results of it. And so some Argentines said, had this war not happened, the junta would not have been forced out of power because it was such an embarrassment, finally. And they do have a cemetery in West Falklands for some of the Argentines that they buried right there. And the families are allowed to come one day a year just to visit their deceased soldiers. But otherwise, there's no trade or shipping or air flights between Argentina and the Falklands to this day. And even this ship is not allowed to come to the Falklands and go back to an Argentine port. That's why we're going to Chile. But here's the monument right downtown in Stanley, and then on the other side of the island, the San Carlos Memorial to the 225 British troops that died there. And there are the due memorials and tributes as go on every year. Here's the governor on the Queen's birthday wearing, I believe that's a peacock hat or a penguin hat, I'm not sure. But this is still an issue, unfortunately. Former President Nestor Kirchner at the UN in 2007 again demanded that the islands be given to Argentina. And of course, the answer from the UK government is this: we settled this issue a while ago, why are you bringing it up? And now Cristina, his wife, the president of Argentina now, has pressed the issue to the point where just the last couple of weeks, she bullied, I think, Uruguay and Brazil into not allowing any visits of any Royal Navy vessels in those countries. And also they've stopped any cooperation on fishing rights in the larger sea. And now there's also no shipping that goes between Chile and the Falklands. So unfortunately, the issue is sort of coming up again. So we wonder what she's planning. She has her own political troubles. You may have heard of in Argentina. There's a lot of opposition to her. She's not likely to get reelected. Her party may not win, and she's in a slippery situation. Well, I'll leave it at that because I'll go on to other more native plants. Now, here's a slippery situation. I'm going to show you the real residents for longer in the Falklands, just some of the natural wildlife that is here. Here's a unique yellow orchid that is endemic to the Falklands. You wouldn't think a tropical flower would live here, but it does. And then this was the endangered fox that has now been exterminated by the ranchers or the sheep herders in the Falklands. And this, they say they're not sure how a fox like that got over here because it couldn't, unless at one time the seas were so low it came over to the islands. But they think maybe there were some natives of the Fuegians, the native people of Tierra del Fuego, that brought them over as pets to the Falkland Islands. But when the Europeans first came to these islands, there was no evidence of any human habitation, so that's a mystery. But in the waters, there's a lot of different life here. There's very rich seas. Here's some of the cumbersome dolphins. You can see them in the harbor. There's also a lot of what they call cold water coral and soft sponges if you want to go scuba diving, and wear your long johns if you do that. But the big thing that we'll go see is, of course, the penguins and the sea lions and the other shore life. So this is what has become the greatest attraction of people going to the Falklands, is all of this abundant sea life that is now all protected and the Falklands have become, in a sense, a large nature reserve. And so here's some elephant seals on the beach, and these big fellows up to 1,800 pounds come up to be with their harems, and then they mate on the beach. I don't think, if I was a female, I don't think I'd find that guy attractive, except that he really knows knows how to bellow, and they have a thing they call the burping, where they don't how they get air in their stomach and they kind of blast. If you ever heard one, it's sort of like a foghorn. Well, here's for adults only. This is a pair of elephant seals mating on the beach, and it's not allowed at Club Med. But here's the female after her time burping back, and then they'll have pups, the little dark black ones, they born with black fur, and then they will suckle on the shore, and then for the winter they go out and they swim and feed on all the many fish from here all the way down to Antarctica. There are a lot of them on South Georgia and South Shetland Islands. There's a whole group of islands south of the Falklands with no human habitation, but they come up to Falklands for the warmth and the beaches just like we do. Now here's our other friends. If you're going on the penguin tour, especially to Bluff Cove, you'll see a lot of Magellanic penguins and gentoos and king penguins. Now, those did anybody go see these today? They were out at some of the points, and these are very abundant penguin, all the way to Montevideo, and in the winter they go up to Brazil. They were being washed up in the currents up in the beaches of Brazil a few years ago, and I was told by a Brazilian friend that people would find them on the beach and they would take them home as pets, except that you can't really feed them. They don't like canned sardines. And so there were signs in the towns in Brazil, if you find a penguin, take it to the zoo. And so the story is that people were walking with their little penguin on a leash, and the police said, you're supposed to take that penguin to the zoo. And the person answered, we already took it to the zoo, but they don't like animals. We're taking it to the theater. Anyway, it's a Brazilian joke. It's funnier in Portuguese. Well, anyway, these guys are very determined. If you were there today, they are sort of not afraid of anything, and then they can hardly walk, but they can fly on the water. And this is, of course, a bird that lost its ability to fly, and then it's so streamlined it can zip through the water. And then there's this one, the gentoo, which is similar size, but it has, for some reason, big red beak, unlike the Magellanic. And then they breed on shore in a nest, and they're a mate together, and they go back to the same nest every year and have 2 to 3 chicks. And so this is the wildlife people come see. Last time I was there, I went up to see the rockhoppers, which is quite a trip out of Stanley over very rough land, but a great trip because you go right to this edge of this cliff, and for some reason, the rockhoppers, instead of living on the beach, where if I was a penguin, that's where I'd stay, they go up to the highest of the peaks. Perhaps they were afraid of some predator, but the only predator they have are actually the skua and the petrel that kind of pick at their chicks if they're not making noise and chasing them off. But here they are up on the high points, and they have to hop from the ocean all the way up those cliffs to get to their nest, which is one of these remarkable things that nature has created. And so they are all on these very craggy little points of land with their molting chicks at this point. In about 2 months, they'll all go back in the water, and they'll swim around, and the colony will be empty for the winter. But these rockhoppers are perhaps the most curious looking because they have these eyebrows, and they look very determined and mean. Now, you might have seen some of these movies where now penguins have been taught how to speak, and they act on the movies. Like, I don't know why they always have a New York accent, though. I don't understand it. But here they are. They have that determined look. And again, if you come up to them, they'll just stare at you as if they're going to devour you. They won't get out of your way. But that's a great sight to go see the rockhoppers. And they are only in these islands. They're not on Tierra del Fuego or other parts of South America or Antarctica. And so this is one of the unique features of this island. And I'm going to finish just showing you some of the more bird life of the islands here. The king cormorant, and these, again, nested by the thousands on certain islands. And many of the outer islands where there are no sheep and also there are no rats or feral cats. Those are the biggest enemies of bird life. The outer islands are now preserves, and you can go out to them and see all these different seabirds and some of the land birds that have not been impacted by the human import of other animals, especially sheep. And I guess the rat is the worst because it'll eat the eggs. So here's one of the large petrels. As we go around the Falklands and then go to Tierra del Fuego and then through the Straits of Magellan and up the Chilean coast, you'll see a lot of these birds. So I'm going to show you some just for identification. Here's the great southern petrel. This is one of the largest of the birds, but depending on the season and the age, it has a kind of a speckled coat. You'll see them following the ship also. Here's a sooty albatross. The albatrosses usually have much sharper wings than the petrels. And here's an Antarctic skua, which is a very vicious bird that will, again, it'll go and attack young penguin chicks. And when we were sailing out of Stanley last week, one of these came and took the hors d'oeuvre right out of my hand at cocktail on deck. You know, they'll actually come and take things out of your hand. But they're hungry. There's a lot of fish down here, but they're always looking for a free meal. And they've heard we have good food on board. So here's some other skuas that are more on the Chilean side. They're brown-bellied. And here's one, the pintado, which is in this area. And Tierra del Fuego, you can see it's called the painted-winged petrel. This is the Antarctic petrel, also cousin to the Arctic petrel, which both have the longest migration in the world from Antarctica to the Arctic. And so they fly 20,000 miles a year in their natural migration. And then there's the large wandering albatross, which has about a 10-foot wingspan, and the black-browed albatross. They have that sort of intent look in their eye. And these are nesting on the islands. You'll see them flying around town, but they're mostly nesting on the outer islands. Here's a feeding being done, and a lot of the birds fish and then regurgitate. And the penguins do that too, of course. And here's the great frigate bird, which will then balloon out its big red throat when it's on land. Now, these are land birds. These are the hunting birds in the hills of the Falklands. The caracara, which there's a similar bird in Patagonia. Here's the oyster catcher, which will break open shells on the shore. The white-tuft grebe, and a snowy sheepbill. And these are all shorebirds and hunters. And these are dolphin penguins. They're also called the dolphin gull or the gray gull. And a kelp goose. You also see upland geese and some quite a variety in the waters and lakes of the Falklands. And here's a steamer duck, which is it looks like a rather uninteresting duck, except that it has the ability to run on the water and can outrun a boat. And that's why they call it a steamer duck. Here's a logger duck that lives up in the uplands. And the ruddy-headed geese. That looks like some of my relatives. And a black-crowned heron. And this is one of the chief predators of the inland hills, the red-backed buzzard or hawk. And you see it has red feathers on the back, though depending on its age, it has different colorations. This is a juvenile, and here's a male that is darker. So these are now endangered, though, because they're carrion eaters. They gathered toxins in their system. But this is the greatest of the penguins here, the king penguin, and they're relatives to the emperor penguins further in in Antarctica. Oops, let me go back. I was going to read a little bit of them. They are different than the other smaller penguins. These get up to about 4 feet tall because the females lay the eggs, and then the males keep them in a fold and their feet, and they actually keep the eggs warm till they hatch, and then they go back to sea and feed them. But I'm going to read you a little writing of a doctor in the Falklands, a veterinarian actually, who wrote about these king penguins. He said, "Light on blue and black and gold, magic in your eye so bold, with darting beak and whir of wing, you sit and gaze, in truth a king. The darkening clouds round you grow, yet what you think we cannot know. Your life not touched by human hand, this place you live, by rights your land. The future is unsure, I feel. The smell and thrill of oil is real. These sparkling clear and raging seas, a danger lurks and fills the breeze. For how much longer will this stay in peace and beauty day by day? I hope forever, king of gems, from nature's womb true beauty stems." And so perhaps it's all of these indigenous animals are actually the real owners of the Falklands, and the human era is just a passing difficulty. But now that they're protected, they are actually rebounding in numbers, and they're the main reason why people come all the way to the Falklands to see this, and it's become a major industry. Now you have up to 6,000 cruise passengers coming in the season to the Falklands, more than the population. And so that means that the Falkland Islanders are actually much more prosperous than mere wool or fishing or other things that are going on. Of course, oil may change all that, and that may be the reason for another, hopefully not a conflict. So I'm going to leave you a last little poem of this Andrew Coe, which goes, "You look at me, I look at you, and who can say which is the fool? You sitting there, me standing here, which one of it is just isn't clear. You think you're smart, I think you're dumb, and I'm not the only one. You smile at me, I laugh at you, because I can see you've trod in my poo." Well, anyway, with that, I hope you have a good visit to these great islands. They are a special place, and may they always be British. Thank you very much.